Okay. Hello and welcome to this dialogue, Mediterranean dialogue, and this dialogue session with Adel Bin Ahmed Al Jubeir, the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia. Welcome, sir. And with me, Matthew Karnitschnig, who is the Chief Europe Editor of Politico. We'll have half an hour to try to get as many answers as possible from you. And I want to begin with a question about the region. Take two examples. In Lebanon and in Iraq, we saw in recent weeks protest movements pushing out prime ministers. They were against corruption, but they were to a certain extent also against Iran and its allies. We've also seen massive protests in Iran that were crushed. What is happening?
I believe the region is saying enough is enough to the Iranians. I believe that what we're seeing in Iran is a result of 40 years of neglect. Since the Khomeini revolution in 1979, the Iranian government has tried to export terrorism, has tried to build a nuclear weapon, has interfered in the affairs of other countries. It has done everything that involves death and destruction, but it has not taken care of its people. And the Iranian people are saying enough is enough, and they're reacting to it. I believe this with regards to Iraq, what we saw last year is demonstrations in Basra against Iran. What we're seeing today is demonstrations across all the Shia areas in Iraq against Iran. And the Iraqi Shia are saying we are Arabs, we don't want Iran interfering in our affairs, and we've had enough of it. In Lebanon, we see for the first time demonstrations by the Shia against Hezbollah in the south. And this is also saying enough is enough. We want our country back, and we want to be a normal country, and we are an Arab country.
So you think that there's really a sea change happening, that Iran is on the back foot in the region after you're denouncing Iran being on the offense?
Well, the Iranians have squandered their resources since 1979, like I said, promoting death and destruction. They have assassinated diplomats, blown up embassies. They have planted terrorism cells. They have spent tens of billions of dollars trying to build a nuclear weapon, which they don't need. They have supported terrorist groups. They have a ballistic missile program to terrorize the region. And like I said, at a certain point, you can't afford it. And at a certain point, people will say enough is enough. And I hope that this is the reaction of the region and of the Iranian people to the aggressive policies of the Iranian regime.
But do you think that we will see the Iranian people succeed this time in rising up? Because we've seen this kind of backlash before in 2009 at other stages over the past 40 years. What makes this different, or is it really different?
I hope so, but I can't assess, because the Iranian regime is the most brutal regime in the world. We saw what they did in 2009. They have no compulsion about killing their people in order to preserve the regime, and I would expect that they will continue to do so. The key is to make sure that Iran remains isolated. The key is to make sure that Iran is under sanctions. The key is to make sure that we deny Iran the resources with which to perpetuate its policies of death and destruction.
Would you say, in a way, that the maximum, quote-unquote, pressure policy applied by the Trump administration, getting out of the nuclear deal, is working despite all the criticism it's getting, especially here in Europe?
Yes. Iran is denied income. Inflation is skyrocketing. Iran's currency is plummeting. And so Iran is feeling the pressure. Iran is losing, is not able to sell its oil. We support the maximum sanctions campaign. We support the withdrawal from the JCPOA. We believe the JCPOA has flaws in it. The first flaw is the sunset provision that lifts the restriction on how much enriched uranium Iran can have after 12 years after the signing of the agreement. We believe that the inspections can be more broad and more intrusive than they currently are. And we also believe that there are two main areas that Iran needs to be held accountable for. One is its support for terrorism and interference in the affairs of other countries. And the second area is its ballistic missile program, which is in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. So if we want to deal with the challenge of Iran, we need to deal with the nuclear program, the missile program, and their support for terrorism and interference in the affairs of other countries.
Just coming back to the JCPOA, as you know, it remains very popular in Europe. The Europeans are still trying to preserve what they can of it. You seem to be saying, well, it would be a good thing if the maximum pressure campaign causes the Iranian regime to collapse, which seems to be something that a lot of Europeans are actually worried about because of the disruption that that could create. And they have, obviously, what happened in Iraq very fresh in their minds. Why are you not worried, or are you worried about that kind of full-blown collapse of Iran and what that could lead to in the broader region?
I don't believe anyone is talking about regime change. What people are talking about is behavior modification. Iran has the principle of exporting the revolution enshrined in its constitution. Iran does not believe in the sovereignty of nations. It believes that every Shia belongs to it. That's like saying Italy claims every Catholic. Do you think Germany and France and Spain would accept this? Of course not. Iran does not believe in the principle of non-interference in the affairs of other countries. It supports terrorism. All of this has to change if Iran wants to be treated as a normal country. And so the thinking behind the maximum pressure campaign is to compel the Iranian government to come to the negotiating table and negotiate a better JCPOA, and negotiate on ballistic missiles, and negotiate on its interference in the affairs of other countries. So the ball is really in Iran's court.
But isn't what we're seeing right now the opposite of that, where you have even, the so-called moderates in Iran coming together with the hardliners, that there's very little difference now within the different interest groups in Iran, that they're all sort of rallying around one another?
I see pressure building up in Iran. I see Iran being more isolated. I think that needs to continue. We have always said that appeasement does not work. Trying to build a parallel money transfer system to SWIFT, it will not work. Trying to provide loans to Iran will not work. That's called appeasement. The appeasement did not work with Hitler in World War II. It will not work with Iran today. The world has to be very firm in what it expects of Iran, and the world has to be very firm in holding Iran accountable. Nobody wants war, but the Iranians cannot be allowed to get away with murder. That has got to stop.
Just one last question on that. Why do you think that the Europeans refuse to accept these arguments? Because we've been going around and around with these arguments for a few years now. Obviously, in the American view, and I think in your view, the JCPOA is dead. The Europeans, the P3, they refuse to accept that reality. Why do you think that is?
I think you should ask them that question. We have explained to them our logic. We continue to discuss this issue with our allies in Europe. There is no doubt that all of the European countries do not want Iran to ever have a nuclear weapon. There's no doubt about that. The question is, how do you stop them? There's no doubt that all the European countries want Iran to stop its ballistic missile program. No doubt. The question is, how do you bring it about? There's no doubt that all the European countries want Iran to stop interfering in the affairs of other countries and support terrorism. No doubt. The question is, how do you do it? And so, name one approach other than maximum sanctions that will bring Iran to the table. Because the policies of the past, from 1979 until now, have not worked. So we need a different approach, and this is the approach that's available.
I want to get to one of the bone of contentions with Iran. It might be an indirect one, Yemen. Clearly, the war is going nowhere, but it seems there might be some interesting developments. We understand your government has opened a channel with the Houthi rebels through Oman. We've seen prisoners being released. We've seen the fighting recede up to a certain point, of course. And it seems you've changed tack on Yemen. You realize the war is not going to be won. Peace needs to be found. Is this what's happening?
We have always maintained that the only solution to Yemen is a political solution. We did not start this war. The Houthis started this war by staging a coup. We interfered as part of a coalition of Arab countries 9 months after the war in Yemen started to support the legitimate government. We took the position that the solution is a Yemeni solution, and we took the position that all Yemenis, including the Houthis, have a role to play in Yemen's future. The war continued. Eventually, the legitimate government was able to reclaim a lot of the territory that the Houthis has occupied, but they still occupy major metropolitan areas. We support the efforts of Martin Griffith to try to bring about peace in Yemen. We had a situation where there was a conflict between the Southern Transitional Council and the legitimate government, and we were able to very quickly move in and work out a peace between them. There will be a new government in Yemen that will be formed, that is being formed as we speak. There have been confidence-building measures that Martin Griffith has been able to work out that involve opening of the Sana'a airport gradually, that involved more ships going into Hodeidah, and that most recently involved the transfer of prisoners. So these are good steps that one can build on. There have been a significant reduction, if not a complete halt, to the missile attacks by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia. There have been a substantial drop in the air operations by the coalition. So I think where there is goodwill, there is the ability to move towards a settlement. At the end of the day, we have always said that Yemen is our neighbor, and the Yemeni people have familial ties and tribal ties with Saudi Arabia. The Houthis themselves, their lands border our territory. And so we want to have the best relations with all Yemenis, including the Houthis. We want an end to this war so we can move towards reconstruction and development.
Right, but all those confidence-building measures do not come out of the blue. They come from those talks, however direct they are, with the Houthis. And that's a big change, because until now it was the Houthis were Iran's proxies. There's no reason why we should talk to them because of what you just said before.
Yeah, I'm hoping that what we say is that Iran's involvement in Yemen is a destructive involvement. It's not a positive involvement. Over a period of 2,000 years, Iran has not laid one brick to build a hospital, a road, or a school. Saudi Arabia has been Yemen's largest contributor of developmental assistance, and we expect to continue to be that, because Yemen is critically important to us. And when Yemen is healthy, it's good for us. When Yemen ails, we are affected. We have a large Yemeni population living in Saudi Arabia. We have had historically very strong ties with all Yemeni groups, and we have family ties and tribal ties between our two countries.
So you're optimistic those talks will bear fruit?
Inshallah, yes.
I'd like to come to your relationship, or Saudi Arabia's relationship, with the United States. As you know, there's been a lot of skepticism about Saudi Arabia within the Democratic Party, in particular, not only amongst the Democrats, since the Khashoggi killing, which you, of course, say was a rogue operation. That said, many in the U.S. establishment don't accept that, still don't accept that. Are you worried, especially if you look at the way President Trump abandoned the Kurds in Syria, are you worried about the alliance with the United States, especially if the Democrats win the presidency next year?
Not at all. Our relationship with the U.S. is bipartisan. Our relationship with the U.S. politically began with a Democratic president when FDR met the late King Abdulaziz at the Great Bitter Lake on the USS Quincy on Valentine's Day in 1945. The relationship has grown every decade. It's broadened, it's deepened, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. And the reason that's the case is because the two countries have a very critically important relationship. Saudi Arabia has the largest oil reserves. The US doesn't need oil, but oil is fungible. You have a shortage of crude oil in one part of the world, everybody on the planet suffers. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam and custodian of the two holy mosques. Saudi Arabia's influence extends to 1.6 billion Muslims. That's critically important to the US. Saudi Arabia sits at the crossroads of 3 continents. Saudi Arabia sits alongside 3 of the world's most critical passageways: the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab al-Mandab, and the Suez Canal. Saudi Arabia is one of the largest financial players in the world. Saudi Arabia is one of the largest energy players in the world. Saudi Arabia and the US are working together to try to stabilize Lebanon, working together to stabilize Iraq, working together to stabilize Afghanistan, working together to calm tensions between India and Pakistan, working together to fight piracy in the Red Sea, working together to support Sudan, to support Egypt, working together in order to defeat Boko Haram in the G5 Sahel countries. So this is a really important relationship. We have huge investments, we have huge trade, We have a huge population of Americans living in Saudi Arabia and visiting Saudi Arabia, and vice versa. So the relationship is not going anywhere. Several years ago, there was talk about a pivot to Asia. What happened? We have more American forces in the Gulf today than we did when people talked about the pivot to Asia. The US role in the Middle East, we don't see it as receding. Quite the contrary. America is a superpower. It has interests. It will pursue those interests. What happened in Iraq was not an abandonment of the Kurds. It was restructuring of American forces. People talk about the US reducing its forces in the region because they pulled out 150 out of northern Syria, but they're sending thousands to Saudi Arabia as we speak. So I don't see this concept of America as receding, quite the contrary. And I don't see anything but a strengthening of the relationship.
You mentioned the troops that President Trump is sending to Saudi Arabia now. Given the history of American troops there, and if you remember, I'm sure you do, the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia was the inspiration for Osama bin Laden originally. Do you think it's really advisable for the U.S. to continue to engage, especially in your country, in such an aggressive way?
Yes. America is our ally, and the American presence in Saudi Arabia helps the security of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi public is fully aware of this. The Saudi public knows that our two countries are partners and that our two countries have stood shoulder to shoulder in fighting terrorism and extremism, and our two countries will stand shoulder to shoulder in pushing back against Iran's nefarious activities.
And are you going to pay for those troops, as President Trump has suggested?
Saudi Arabia has always carried its weight. From the day our relationship with the US began, we are not a burden on anyone.
I'll take that as a yes.
I just said we are not a burden on anyone. We and the US are allies, and we have always paid our fair share.
I want to get to another regional issue, Qatar. Obviously, there's been a big dispute with Qatar for the past 2.5 years between you and several of your allies in the region. Next week, there's going to be a summit of the Gulf Cooperation Council in Riyadh. The Saudi king officially invited the Emir of Qatar. He hasn't gone to Saudi Arabia for such summits since the dispute. So will he go? And there have also been reports that Qatar's foreign minister went to Saudi Arabia, probably to discuss. And I should add, and maybe last but not least, there was a football tournament in Qatar where Saudi Arabia participated, and Qatar was kind enough to lose yesterday the semifinal against Saudi Arabia.
I think we're very happy with the win of our soccer team, and I think they won because they
football diplomacy can work.
Well, because they performed very well. We have the Emir of Qatar was invited to the GCC summit, as he was invited to the GCC Arab and Islamic summits in June of this year. He was invited last year to the GCC summit, and he was invited to the Arab League summit that was held in the Eastern Province. So whether he attends or not is really something that you should address to our Qatari colleagues. The Qataris know what needs to be done. They know where the problem lies, and they need to take the steps necessary in order to overcome those problems. We have always said that we have a common history with Qatar and we have a common destiny, but there are policies that have to change, and we hope they will change.
Have they started changing, and are there reports that the foreign minister went to Saudi Arabia to discuss those 13 demands? True.
We have seen some changes in the laws with regards to terror financing by Qatar, but there needs to be more steps taken, and I believe they understand what those steps are.
And you believe it's on the right path, just like Yemen, that this could be a point of tension that might disappear in the near future?
I'm always an optimist, but it really is up to the Qataris to take the steps that need to be taken.
Well, you could show more flexibility maybe on some of those demands.
Well, it's up to them to take the steps necessary when they know what they are.
I'd like to come to another flashpoint, which is the Israeli-Palestinian situation. There was some optimism in some quarters of Washington about Trump's plan for a peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. it hasn't really gone anywhere so far. How do you view this plan, which was put together by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner?
Well, it hasn't been presented yet. Our position has been and remains that a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be based on a two-state settlement, based on the Arab League Arab Peace Initiative and based on the relevant Security Council resolutions, with the ultimate outcome being a Palestinian state on 67 borders with minor and mutually agreed to adjustments, with East Jerusalem as its capital. We have always said that once this happens, then there will be peace between not only Israel and the Arab world, but Israel and the Islamic world. The Arab Peace Initiative that was put on the table in 2002 was reiterated every year at every Arab summit. In 2005, at a December Islamic summit, the OIC countries adopted the peace initiative. So now you're looking at the peace with 57 countries. But we need to get this going, and annexing territory, continuing the settlements, that is not conducive to this. And so our view is the solution and the settlement is clear. We need the political will in order to get there.
But everything you describe is being supported by the Trump administration. So by that logic, we would be moving further away from the two-state solution.
We've made that clear to our friends that unilateral actions are not acceptable and are not conducive to promoting peace.
But if I may, the Palestinians were very optimistic at the outset. They had meetings with President Trump. President Abbas came out. He was really, he thought this would happen. And clearly, they've been totally disappointed. When you ask them, they say, we don't believe there is actually a plan. We don't believe it will ever be presented. And those who pretend to continue to believe it are just lying. So the Palestinians have lost any hope. Why are you still hopeful Trump or his administration will come up with this so-called deal of the century?
You have to always be optimistic, because otherwise you can't solve problems. And you have to keep trying until you get to a solution that is acceptable to all parties. And so we can't raise our hands and give up. That's not what we do. If you want to be a diplomat, you have to be an optimist. Otherwise, you should be a commentator. With all due respect to commentators, but...
Right, but I mean, are you conveying those concerns that little by little the Trump administration is killing the two-state solution? From your viewpoint?
From our viewpoint,
that's what diplomats do.
We've from day one, we have outlined what we thought would be the fair settlement. We have provided our advice with regards to what we thought the approach should be. We have offered to work with the US and the international community to try to encourage the two parties to move towards such a solution, but we can't force our views on the other side.
There's always a lot of rumors about your contacts with the Israeli government behind the scenes. Are you cooperating with them or discussing with them in any way about what we've just discussed here, the two-state solution?
We have no ties with the Israelis, and so we don't communicate with them. There are certain challenges where both countries see eye to eye with regards to threats from Iran and what Iran is doing in the region, but we have no relationship with the Israelis. And our point is, until there is a peace, normalization cannot happen.
Right. Because we're nearing the end. Obviously, as Matthew pointed out, after Jamal Khashoggi murder, Saudi Arabia has been incurring a lot of criticism about its human rights record, and even their human rights groups are saying that Saudi Arabia is still going after dissenters, not only inside Saudi Arabia, but outside of Saudi Arabia. And therefore, it was actually not a rogue operation, but the modus operandi of the Saudi regime. What's your response?
Our response is that this was a huge mistake that was not authorized. The Saudi government has never murdered any of its citizens. There was investigation. We have more than 20 people investigated. 11 are currently facing trial, and 5 of them are facing potentially the death sentence. The government has taken steps to put in place mechanisms in our intelligence services to prevent something like this from happening again. So we investigated, we're holding people accountable, and we're putting in place mechanisms to stop it from happening again. When Abu Ghraib happened, did President Bush give the order? Did Secretary Rumsfeld give the order? No. Mistake happened, unauthorized investigation, hold people accountable, put in place procedures to prevent it from happening again. When Oliver North was embarked on Iran-Contra, he thought that President Reagan wanted this. And President Reagan didn't. What did the US do? It investigated, held people accountable, put in place procedures to prevent it from happening again. And this is what we're doing in Saudi Arabia. And I tell people, before you begin and charge Saudi Arabia with something, wait until the process plays out and then judge us, not beforehand. Isn't the principle innocent until proven guilty? In this case, it was flipped upside down. With regards to human rights in Saudi Arabia, we're making great progress. We are liberating women and liberating youth. Bans that existed in the past no longer exist. Women can get a passport and travel freely without anyone's permission. Women get the same pay for the same job. In the foreign ministry, for example, 5 years ago, the incoming class of diplomats was 10% women. Last year, the incoming class was 50% women. So we're making strides, and we're moving, and we're looking at our laws, and we're looking at our legal system, and we're looking at our educational system. Our objective under Vision 2030 is to make Saudi Arabia a dynamic place, an innovative place, a society based on technology, moderation, openness, and inclusivity. And this is what we're working towards.
Okay, I believe we have to end it here. We're told that we have 30 minutes and no more. Thank you very much, Minister Al Jubeir. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain.